Throughout history, inexplicable events have occurred within the walls of churches, leaving believers and skeptics alike searching for answers. There have been countless reports of statues weeping blood, sacred images illuminating without a light source, and mysterious healings with no medical explanation. But what happens when an entire congregation witnesses something so extraordinary that no one can deny its authenticity? How do you explain a moment when the divine makes itself visible in a way no one can ignore? The answers to these questions often lie in faith, but sometimes they manifest in ways that even the most doubtful minds cannot refute. When a priest, known for his composure and deep spiritual discipline, is suddenly overwhelmed with tears in the middle of Mass, something beyond human understanding is at play. If you enjoy content that helps you grow spiritually, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join our community for more inspiration. Let's get started. This is not simply emotion, it is an encounter with something greater than himself. And when those present begin to experience something inexplicable at the same time, it is no longer a personal experience. It becomes a collective phenomenon. The church was packed that day with families, elderly worshippers, and young children filling every pew. It was supposed to be a solemn and traditional service, just like any other Sunday. The priest, standing at the altar, began the liturgy as usual, his voice steady, his hands firm. But within moments, something shifted in the atmosphere. A distinct fragrance, unlike anything anyone had ever smelled, began to spread through the air. It was sweet, yet powerful, almost as if roses were blooming from within the very walls of the church. The scent wasn't coming from the candles or the flowers arranged near the altar. It had no source, yet it became impossible to ignore. At first, people exchanged confused glances, unsure of whether they were the only ones noticing it. Then, the feeling in the air changed. A warmth, soft yet undeniable, wrapped around them. Not like the heat of the sun, but like an invisible embrace. Some felt their chests tighten, overwhelmed by emotion, while others instinctively lowered their heads, sensing an unseen presence moving among them. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of the missal. Then, without warning, his voice cracked. He pressed his fingers against his forehead, eyes glistening, struggling to hold back the tears. A sudden hush fell over the congregation. No one spoke, no one moved. The air was heavy with something unexplainable. And then, as if carried by the silence itself, an unmistakable whisper rippled through the church. A voice, distant yet clear, speaking words that no human had uttered. The scent of roses intensified, weaving through the air like incense, yet there were no flowers beyond the simple arrangement near the altar. Some wiped their eyes, believing it to be a trick of the senses, but the overwhelming presence in the church could not be dismissed. The priest, still visibly shaken, clutched the chalice, his fingers trembling as he tried to steady his breath. Then, the first whisper came. We all face moments when the world around us feels unexplainable, when logic fails to grasp the mysteries unfolding before our eyes. In those moments, understanding the unseen can be the key to finding knowledge. This is exactly what The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions offers, a path to clarity and peace through his revelations. This ebook goes into his prophecies and offers insight into what lies ahead. It's available for free in the pinned comment. Grab it now before the edition's gone. At first, it was barely audible, a soft murmur that seemed to float through the air like a breeze moving through an empty hall. But as seconds passed, it grew clearer, taking on the resonance of a voice, yet without a speaker. The language was unknown, yet deeply familiar, as though the soul could understand what the mind could not. A few people turned, trying to locate the source, but there was none. The whisper did not come from a person. It came from everywhere. Children clung to their parents, sensing the gravity of the moment despite their innocence. A woman in the second row gasped, her hand gripping the edge of the pew as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. A man who had not stepped foot in a church in over a decade suddenly fell to his knees, his head bowed, tears rolling down his cheeks. Whatever this presence was, it was undeniable. The priest swallowed hard, blinking as if trying to clear his vision. The air around the altar shimmered, not with light, but with something unseen, something that could be felt rather than observed. It was not the golden glow of the candles, nor the reflection of the stained glass windows. It was something else entirely. The whispering grew softer, fading into an almost unbearable silence. Then, the host inside the priest's hands began to glow. A radiance, faint at first, pulsed from the small, consecrated bread. It was not the reflection of the chandeliers, nor the simple glimmer of candlelight. It was something else, something living. A gasp rippled through the congregation as the glow intensified, spreading outward as though the very air was illuminated from within. The priest took an unsteady step back, his eyes widening in disbelief. The scent of roses became almost overpowering, yet no one dared to move. Then, as if the weight of the moment had reached its peak, a low, resonant hum filled the air. Not from an instrument, not from the choir, but from something unseen. It vibrated within the very walls of the church, like the sound of heaven itself, breaking through the veil of the physical world. The priest's fingers stiffened as he looked at the host in his hands. The glow had intensified, but something was different. It wasn't just radiating light anymore. The smooth white wafer had begun to darken, the edges shifting from pure white to a deep reddish hue. The transformation was slow but undeniable. A sharp gasp broke the silence. A woman in the front row clutched her rosary as the change became impossible to ignore. The once thin piece of bread now had visible fibers, a texture no longer resembling flour and water, but something organic, something living. A dark red began to seep from the center, soaking into the priest's fingertips. The scent of roses thickened in the air, but beneath it, something else lingered, a metallic sharpness, unmistakable. The murmurs spread across the congregation as more eyes locked onto the miracle unfolding before them. A child pulled at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is it bleeding?" The mother, unable to respond, only tightened her hold on him, her breath shaky. Some moments are meant to change everything. Only a few copies of the free ebook remain. Get yours now in the first pinned comment before they're gone. The priest's mind raced. He had read about Eucharistic miracles, studied accounts of similar events throughout history, but never imagined witnessing one himself. The weight of the moment bore down on his chest. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. His body knew what his mind had yet to accept. This was real. Someone in the back whispered the Lord's Prayer, voice trembling with emotion. Others followed, their voices weak at first, then rising in unison, as if instinctively turning to prayer was the only way to process what their eyes refused to deny. The host in the priest's hands pulsed again, a slow but rhythmic movement, as if it were still alive. The priest's breath grew uneven as his gaze remained fixed on the host. The glow pulsated, shifting between a soft radiance and an intensity that sent flickering reflections across the golden chalice. The air around the altar carried a weight, as if something unseen pressed against the very fabric of reality. A woman near the front row let out a quiet sob, her hands gripping the pew in front of her. She wasn't alone. Others had begun to cry, though they could not explain why. A man in his 60s, A skeptic who had only attended the Mass to accompany his wife sat frozen, staring in disbelief at the unfolding scene. The whispering had returned. No longer distant, it resonated with a divine clarity, carrying a language not of this world. The priest could hear it inside his mind, not through his ears. He shut his eyes tightly, but the voice did not leave him. It was neither overwhelming nor fearful. It was filled with authority, yet love, commanding, yet gentle. A sudden warmth radiated from the altar, sweeping across the church in a wave that sent shivers down the spine of every person present. Then, the priest lifted his head, his lips parting slightly. His body tensed, his pupils dilated. A single tear slid down his cheek as his expression transformed into something indescribable. Awe, terror, joy, surrender. Behind the flickering candlelight and the shimmering air, a shape began to take form. It was not an apparition in the traditional sense. There was no mist, no human-like silhouette. Yet within the cascading light, the unmistakable outline of a figure stood behind the altar. The priest gasped, stepping back as his knees weakened. He had no doubt who stood before him. A presence that could not be contained, a presence that felt older than time itself. The congregation could feel it too. A child clung to her mother, whispering, "He's here." A young man, previously indifferent, clasped his hands together in a gesture of desperate reverence. The glow from the host pulsed again, and suddenly the candles at the altar flickered violently, as if caught in an unseen wind. A low hum spread through the air, and with it, the faint but unmistakable sound of footsteps, approaching, yet coming from nowhere. Not everything can be explained, but some things are too important to ignore. The free ebook is almost out of copies. Claim yours while you still can in the first pinned comment. The host in the priest's hands continued to change. What had started as a transformation of texture had now become something unmistakable. The Eucharist no longer resembled bread at all. The blood had pooled into the crevices of its surface, forming patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. Some believed they saw letters, others the faint shape of a face. A man who had entered the church, indifferent, stood paralyzed, his breathing uneven. The atmosphere had become so dense that even the most skeptical among them felt something beyond logic at play. From the far side of the church, a blind man, guided by his wife, suddenly shuddered. He raised his head sharply, his fingers tightening around the pew in front of him. Confusion spread across his face, then shock. He turned his head toward his wife and whispered, trembling, "I can see." The woman gasped. Those nearby heard him and turned. He was known to the community, blind since birth, with no medical explanation for what had just happened. Some backed away in disbelief. Others, overwhelmed, broke into tears. A sudden heat surged through the church, like fire passing through the walls, yet nothing burned. The candles at the altar flickered violently, then steadied, their flames rising impossibly high. The statue of Christ on the crucifix above the altar tilted forward slightly, as if bowing toward the Eucharist. "Do this in remembrance of me." The voice wasn't human. It filled every inch of the church, yet had come from nowhere. The priest had not spoken, no one had, but all had heard it. A child pointed toward the altar, his small voice trembling. "Look!" Shadows twisted across the walls. The glow that had surrounded the Eucharist now extended outward, reaching toward the priest like rays of unseen hands. Something stood behind him, something undeniable. A man in the back collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Another, who had mocked faith for years, whispered, "He's here." A shimmering presence hovered behind the priest. No longer a vague outline, it had taken on a form. A figure of light, radiating an intensity that no human could withstand. The glow wasn't from the candles or the stained glass windows. It had no earthly origin. A sudden gust of wind swept through the church, though every door and window remained shut. The chandeliers above swayed, the wooden pews groaned, and the altar cloth rippled as if touched by unseen hands. People clung to one another, uncertain whether to shield their eyes or stare in awe. The blind man who had regained his sight now wept uncontrollably. A woman, paralyzed for years, moved her legs for the first time, standing with difficulty, her cries lost in the voices rising around her. Others gasped as pain, sickness, and afflictions vanished in an instant. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Isaiah 35, 5-6. The priest remained frozen, his hands still holding the transformed host, his mind unable to comprehend the enormity of the moment. Then a single drop of blood fell from the Eucharist onto the altar, and with it, a sound, like a heartbeat. Signs appear when we least expect them. If you're seeing this now, don't wait. There are only a few free downloads left. Find yours in the first pinned comment. The walls trembled, but nothing cracked. The sound wasn't destructive. It was alive. A presence too vast to be contained by the church alone had descended among them. The congregation, overwhelmed, collapsed into prayer, some whispering words they hadn't spoken in years. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the glow began to fade. The air, once thick and charged, began to settle. The invisible force that had held them in awe released its grip. The heartbeat, the shimmering light, the whispering voices, all began to withdraw. If this message makes you think and you feel it connects with you, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Also, if you really want to support our work and help us keep creating valuable content, consider giving us a super thanks. Join this amazing community and don't miss any news. A final whisper passed through the church, so faint it barely reached the ears, yet it imprinted itself onto every soul present. I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Matthew 28:20.